We know how to add and subtract signed numbers. Our next question is, how shall we multiply them? To start with, let's think back to how we understood multiplying two positive numbers together. So, for example, we understood 4 times 3 to mean 4 copies of the number 3 added together. Well, really, we can understand 4 times negative 3 in exactly the same way. Right? We can understand that as 4 copies of negative 3 all added together. On the number line, what would that look like? We'll start from 0, go 3 to the left, and another 3 to the left, another 3 to the left, and another 3 to the left. We'll get negative 12, where 4 times positive 3 was positive 12. Of course, there isn't anything special about 4 and 3 here, right? This is an instance of a general rule. A positive number times another positive number is always a positive number. Here we see another general rule. A positive number times a negative number is always a negative number. All right, so far so good. How then shall we understand negative 4 times positive 3? Well, let's look again at the pattern of what happens when we multiply by positive 3, right? Positive 4 times positive 3 was 4 copies of the number 3 added together. Positive 3 times positive 3, well, that would just be 3 copies. It takes 1 fewer 3's to make our 9 than it did to make the 12. 2 times 3, well, that's just 2 copies of the number 3. Again, 1 less 3 to make the 6. 1 times 3, that's just 1 copy of the number 3. Again, 1 3 fewer. 0 times 3, that isn't any copies of 3 at all. Three less again. So what must negative 1 times 3 be? Well, we take away a 3. Negative 1 times 3 must be negative 3. Right? Negative 2 times 3, that must be that negative 3, take away another 3. Think of that minus 3 as adding in a negative 3. We get negative 6. Negative 3 times 3, negative 3, minus 3, minus 3, we'll get negative 9. Right, subtracting 3 again, or adding negative 3. So negative 4 times 3, subtract another 3, go another 3 to the left. Negative 4 times positive 3. is also negative 12. And again, that's an instance of a general rule. A negative number times a positive number is always a negative number. How do we think about this? We think of multiplication by a negative as repeatedly subtracting. Why do I mention that? Right? Why go into all this detail? Well, this is going to give us an insight into the surprising thing that happens when we take a negative times a negative. Right? Negative 4 times negative 3, we think of that as repeatedly subtracting negative 3. Four copies of negative 3, and we subtract each. But we agreed that subtracting negative 3 is like adding positive 3. So we're really adding together 4 copies of positive 3, which is positive 12. That's kind of surprising, right? That's totally different than what happened with addition. Negative 4 times negative 3 is positive 12. As a general rule, a negative number times a negative number is a positive number. Right? We can summarize our rules for multiplication. And these are a little bit simpler. They're a little bit less thinky than the rules that we had for addition. But they've got this really surprising one thrown in there. What are the rules? A positive times a positive is a positive. A positive times a negative is a negative. A negative times a positive is a negative. And then finally a negative times a negative is a positive. Again, remember, this is different from addition. Do you remember what the rules for addition were? If not, go back and rewatch the video adding signed numbers. Now I'm just going to mention this now, but we're going to see the reason for this later on. Division follows the same rules as multiplication. The reason for this is easiest to see once we have fractions, and so I'm going to hold off on justifying this for the moment. We will see the reason, just not quite yet.